Hi, I'm Joel Persinger. I'm the Gun Guy. Thank you very much for all of your support of GunGuyTV. I'm very, very grateful. Please check out these other locations because we're in the middle of an election year and censorship at YouTube in particular is going to ratchet up. Obviously, X and Rumble have never censored me and probably never will. So if you want to make sure you get the content and it isn't shadow banned or whatever, check me out in one of those two places. Today I've got an interview with a guy who's a longtime friend of mine and a fellow who's a friend of his. Both of them are veterans. Both of them were in law enforcement forever and a day. Both of them have a ton of experience both in law enforcement but also in private sector security. And both of them currently work in those roles. In the case of Dave Weiner, he was an SRT team leader, a SWAT team commander, a police chief, and now owns a company called Secure Measures that trains law enforcement. And fortunately for me, Dave also works with me quite a bit, so I'm encouraged to see him. One of the departments he trains for a lot is the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. In the case of Scott Walker, Scott was obviously a veteran and then federal law enforcement, and now is an investigator for an international company and travels around the world doing investigations at the same time. He has a training company that is headquartered in Phoenix, Arizona. And so these guys have had decades of experience, and now they're seeing what's happening in law enforcement, kind of the same thing I'm seeing, but fortunately for all of us, they have sort of the inside baseball look, and that's what we're going to talk about. Scott has coined this whole coming disaster, if you want to call it that, law enforcement zero. In other words, we're going to zero law enforcement. Now, if you want to watch the entire interview, it's an hour and a half long, and it is on Gun Guy TV crew only. What I've done is edit it down for you here, a bit more concise, but obviously not all the information is there. This is still a great interview, so I urge you to watch it. All right, let's go talk to Dave and Scott. One of the things that I'm seeing, these guys are now in the private sector. Obviously, Dave is still doing a lot of training for law enforcement. I do a lot of training for security because that's what our business is, basically, and then concealed carry and so on. So I've been involved in the security industry for a long time, and I was director of security at a couple of places. And then, what I'm seeing from the outside of law enforcement now looking in is I see this sort of different trend lines. I don't have a chart for you, I'm sorry, but one of the trend lines I see is that crime is increasing. And more worrisome to me is that not only is crime increasing, but the boldness of criminals is increasing because of the lack of enforcement, the lack of punishment. They seem to have less fear of law enforcement, less fear of the consequences of criminal actions. At the same time, we have law enforcement seems to be shrinking in its involvement. And I would say if it is doing that, a couple of the reasons that I would come up with are, one, we went through that whole defund the police thing, and many people think that that's over, but it's not. Most of these agencies, a lot of the agencies I talk with, don't have the funding they need. They don't have the people they need. They're going through a lot of this woke cultural crap. And so now you have a lot of officers. Some of my friends have just popped smoke and they're out. I mean, they can retire or whatever, or they get a better job and they just are gone. So you have this sort of brain trust of experience and knowledge in law enforcement that's leaving. And at the same time, they're not recruiting enough because young people don't want to be cops anymore. They see what happens on social media and the news, and they don't want to put themselves through that. So not only are you have a lot of people leaving, but you're not replacing the numbers. And then even if you replace the numbers, you're not replacing them with the same quality of people that are leaving. And I don't mean to say that the people coming in are low quality, but they don't have the experience. They don't have the knowledge. They don't have any of that that's leaving. And so when I look at all of that, I'm not seeing a trend that's boding well for us in this country. And it's concerning. To say that it's concerning is probably a bit of an understatement, but I'm curious what your thoughts are, and just go ahead, guys, whatever you want to share about that.
You mind if I go first, D?
Take it away, man. Take it away.
It's one of my favorite topics to talk about, but I come at it from a little bit different area than most people. Certainly, there are the social aspects of law enforcement that have changed significantly since all of us were in law enforcement. But the aspect that I think is probably underrated, or at least not covered as much, is the demographic aspect. And so what we all know is that in the 80s, there was a huge hiring push in law enforcement, local, federal. The war on drugs was running fast and furious. And then in the 90s, we had a pretty significant change of administration, and that dropped the law enforcement need. Same thing with the military. What we saw in the military was higher tenure and Brex, or the base realignment and closures, right? And there was all kinds of, hey, we need as much military because we're not fighting all these wars and doing all these things because the administration didn't want to. Then what happened on September 11th, 2001 was, okay, we need more federal law enforcement, right? And so we're right back up into this big surge. Well, not only did we say, hey, we need federal law enforcement, that means we needed Border Patrol, we needed Customs, we needed this new thing. Wasn't new, but everybody else thought it was new. This new Air Marshal Service. Who are these guys? We got to pull everybody from Secret Service into the Air Marshals, right? And the same thing with the military. Hey, now we are going to be at war in Iraq and Afghanistan at the same time. So now we need more military members, and that we fought a war for 20 years, right? For all intents and purposes, we're still at war in the Middle East, and that's a whole other story. But so we've hired and recruited people from a generation that could support it. We hired cops in the 70s and 80s who came out of the baby boom generation. And that was the biggest generation the United States had ever seen, right? But the biggest generation the world had ever seen, really. And that propelled us into the 80s and 90s. And now here we are in the 2010s and the 2020s, where those folks have 20, 30, and 40 years in that role. So they're leaving. Some of them in federal law enforcement, you're forced out at 57. So that generation will be gone by 2025. That's a fact. They will age out. By 2030, they will be the youngest baby boomer by 2030 will be 65, retirement age, right?
I thought I was the youngest baby boomer, and I'm almost 66.
You look like not a day over 25. If they can't see you
not
on
a day
YouTube.
over 75. That's what I look like. I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Scott. I didn't mean to get
These,
okay.
these cameras have really good filters, by the way.
Yeah, I'm just agreeing with you because yeah, right. The baby boomers, they were getting old. And I didn't even know there were any behind me.
So who replaces it? And that's exactly where I want to go. Who replaces the baby boomers as Gen X? What Gen X has always experienced is an inability en masse, and I'm being very broad here, I realize, but we've experienced an inability to climb the ladder. Baby boomers, because there were so many of them, came out of the womb fighting because there were so many of them. I got to get to school. I got to get the job. I got to keep the job for 20 years. Gen X hasn't had that ability. We haven't had that, hey, you can make it in this world and you can be the chief of police, to use the law enforcement context, eventually. Because there were so many more baby boomers ahead of us. We were a very small generation. We really came out of the silent generation that fought World War II. So our generation was very small, but big generations have big generations. So what does the baby boomers have? They have the millennials. I hate to say it, the millennials are going to save us because there are more millennials than there are Gen X. So they're just now, I mean, they've been in the industry or in law enforcement now for nearly a decade, right? In all, they are starting to become, and in the private sector, I keep talking about the 30-year-old chief security officer. Well, we need to start talking about the 30-year-old chief of police. And I know that freaks everybody out and their heads are exploding and you're going to get all kinds of comments and the keyboard warriors are going to go crazy. No, that's not going to happen. Yeah, okay, boomer. It's going to happen. It's already happening. We've seen it happen with smaller agencies. We're going to start seeing it with larger agencies where we have somebody who has maybe 10 years on a law enforcement agency and they're getting into senior supervision, senior command staff positions. So it's because there aren't enough baby boomers that are staying or that can stay or want to stay. And there's certainly not enough Gen Xers work. And then here we creep into the 2010s. And what happens in the 2010s, we all know, we've all lived it in law enforcement, was the public had a significant backlash against perceived overextension of force by law enforcement. And then nobody wanted to be in law enforcement anymore. So we have this nobody wants to be in law enforcement coupled with there are no more humans. I call it LE zero, law enforcement zero. Law enforcement's going to zero. So that's where we are in this current state of churn. And what we're seeing with the politics in the United States, with the southern border in the United States, and what we're seeing overseas is all contributing to that friction. And of course, you can watch on YouTube every single officer involved shooting from every major law enforcement agency. I just watched one where an officer was killed in the line of duty right there. They didn't even blur it on YouTube. And so why YouTube would demonetize you, Joel, is beyond me. But now we've had a generation of people that have grown up with that and they've seen that. It's been in their face. And by the way,
Yeah.
all their friends agree with, well, you call them your partner, not your spouse. You use these specific terms and not this other term. And you call the person this and you don't call them that. And they're being dictated to. Of course, they don't want to go into law enforcement.
I want to
It,
back up here just a
yeah.
second, Scott. Just ask you to define law enforcement zero for me. What do you mean by that term?
Well, when we don't have anybody who wants to do the job, and we don't have anybody who can do the job, who's going to do the job? State of California is looking at down this barrel. They have the largest law enforcement presence in the United States. And I have heard, although it's not confirmed, or I can't give you a source, but I've heard they've been talking about, do we really need the the requirement that you be a U.S. citizen to be a commissioned law enforcement officer? And that's a pretty drastic change, right? I think we all remember when cocaine was okay to have done one time on your
Right.
background, right? Everybody remembers like, oh my gosh, that was a big deal. Marijuana, oh, that was a big deal. You can't have people smoking the reefer and then getting into law enforcement. Well, it's not a big deal. But now we're talking about non-citizens potentially, or some level of non-citizenship that may have the ability to be commissioned peace officers. So this is that part of that churn of like, well, if we can't find somebody, we'll outsource it.
I mean, do you see a time, either one of you, in which we start seeing private companies providing law enforcement services
We're
rather than
there.
it being public employees? We're already there?
We're seeing experiments with non-sworn investigators, for example. Some of these bigger agencies, Phoenix PD, where I live, has non-sworn civilian investigators now that are assigned to, Family Services Bureau, or they're assigned to homicide, and they work on cases. They're not going to be the ones that go kick the door, but they can support their sworn partners.
To Scott's point about a couple things, the 30-year-old police chief, I was 43, I believe, 44 when I promoted into my role, well over a decade ago. Um, but what's interesting too is when I talk to some of the agencies that I currently do training for, I'm hearing about field training officers being in the field that have 2 or 3 years on.
Yeah.
When back in the day, you used to have somebody out there that had been minimum 10 years.
10, 15, right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have sergeants getting promoted, 5 years, 6 years. You're a lot of institutional knowledge is going out the door. And you're getting, to Scott's point, a very different generation of people that communicate very differently,
Mhm.
that receive information very differently. I would say one of the biggest things I've heard is a lot of these recruits constantly ask why. Why do we have to do stuff? Why do we have to do
The
this? Why do we have to
audacity.
do that? Right? Um, Whereas, back in the day, if in the academy especially, or in, basic training or boot camp or whatever, if a drill sergeant told you to do something, there wasn't why, there wasn't a whole lot of that. And to tag along to Scott's non-sworn, I believe some agencies out there are also doing some test and learn with sending um, basically what would amount to security
Yeah.
to, low-level noise complaints, parking violations, things that aren't going to potentially tie up a sworn officer from responding to higher level calls for service. So sending them to that barking dog call or that loud music call but unfortunately, we all know that those low level calls, and probably most of us have been there, can sometimes rapidly evolve into something. And that's the rub, and that's what a lot of the public doesn't always get, in the sense that your music call could turn into something else. And frequently, and Scott knows this, and Joel, you know this, the call that you get over your radio or your MDC is rarely the call you arrive to. It's hardly ever the same call that goes into dispatch. When you get there, it's something completely different.
How does this how does this affect the citizen? You think this road we're going down? How does it affect them today? And I'm going to ask you both to prognosticate a little bit. What do you think the effect on them is going to be down the road if we continue down the same path?
This is the Wild West all over again, just reimagined. You know, back in the late 1800s, post Civil War, manifest destiny. We're moving west. We're finding gold. We're finding copper. We're finding natural resources, and we're going to exploit them. That was the focus, and that's where the money was going. So there was no law enforcement there. So what did they do? They hired one, sheriff, or they hired a ranger, and that became how you enforced law in the population. But we had this unique thing called posses. We still have them here in Arizona because we're still the Wild West. We're state 48, right? We're the youngest state, contiguous state. And so that's where you grab citizens who you feel are worthy or trained or have the bravery to confront evil and crime. And you swear them to a similar oath, the same oath as the deputy who is getting paid to go do what deputies do. And so I think, we talked about exporting or using outside resources outside of government resources, private sector security, things like that. That's definitely something. But I think that we'll also see, and we're starting to see this now, where you have either citizen groups, like formulated citizen groups, or you have citizens themselves who are taking it upon themselves to police or patrol their cities. And it doesn't have to be the neighborhood watch. Everybody knows what that is, and they've seen that. And we've seen where it can go, kind of sideways. But I do think that the citizens are becoming more involved to say, not in my backyard. The NIMBY thing is changing. And there are people in, the Pacific Northwest and the West Coast of the United States that are tired of seeing Target leave their community because of crime. And they're taking action to say, I'm going to either report these things more, I'm going to get my camera phone out and I'm going to record, or they're taking some type of enforcement activity because they're sick and tired of it. They want their kids to grow up in neighborhoods that they don't have to, get them off the street when the street lights come on. But that's the world that we're going towards.
When you describe the return of a time when citizens will step up and take care of their own neighborhood and that kind of stuff, I think part of that is cultural, but part of it is also the legal culture. In Arizona, if I happen to be there and some deputy's getting owned and I help, I don't run much risk of getting prosecuted or sued into oblivion or losing my house or losing my job or finding myself in jail for 20 years. But if I do it in California, I do. And so again, we get back to how does this affect the citizen? Obviously, in a state like Arizona or Texas or Tennessee or whatever, that's one thing. But you get in these wonky, blue, hyper over-regulated nanny states, and it seems to me, I don't know, you were a cop in California your entire career, Dave, as far as I know. I mean, it just strikes me that the citizen is out of luck. Because if we're at law enforcement zero and the citizen is going to get punished if they step up, where's that leave us, Dave?
A lot of people that I talk to, especially a lot of our law enforcement partners, every one of them said, "Yeah, I'm in my window for retirement, and as soon as I hit that window, I'm out of California. I'm done." Because of the overregulation. And Scott and I know about this because this just popped, but there was a guy who in Arizona stabbed a couple of people. He was being sought after by NYPD and U.S. Marshals. And he ended up stabbing a couple of people in Arizona. He's from New York, and Arizona has refused to extradite because they said he ain't getting prosecuted in New York, but he going to get prosecuted here,
Yeah, we'll take
right?
care of it.
So I think you're going to see a lot of people gravitating towards places like those areas that actually prosecute people that abide by the rule of law, and that's why we have these laws. And we don't consistently need more laws when we already have laws on the books. There's a ton of laws, but California in particular, to your point, Joel, earlier, is certainly well overregulated. Overregulated and over legislated for everything. Um, and that makes it tough for a lot of things. That's why a lot of people are leaving the state. And Scott, I agree with you. There's a monster deficit coming.
That's definitely what I saw. I mean, my motivation, look, I wish everybody the best in finding out where they want to live in the world. But our motivation was our kids were out of school and it was time to leave California. And then we had a lockdown in California. I lived in the Bay Area. And we had to figure out, okay, we just bought a house in Arizona. How do we will they continue to build the house? And then how do we sell a
How do we
house?
get there?
And yeah,
Yeah.
like how do we make this happen? And it's a lockdown.
Well, so I can
And
explain to you how to get out. You have to kind of crawl under the razor wire past the guard towers, make sure that the light doesn't shine on you when you go by, and then they'll
wait
let you
for the
out of
dog to
California.
go by.
Wait for the
Yeah.
dog to go
Yeah.
by. Right.
Well,
That's how you
but I
do
mean,
that.
everybody's going through that now. It's like, and we're in this really topsy-turvy time, even with politics, right? And we don't
Yeah.
know what's going to happen in January of 2025. We don't know what's going to happen in November of 2024. So, all of those
Yeah,
things
but
play a role.
but this thing is, truthfully, I'm not terribly frightened of it, but it is a frightening thing when you have lived in a society that for 100 and some odd years has had police departments.
Yeah.
And we're used to having police departments. If it was 150 years ago, we wouldn't have police departments. We didn't have police departments. They weren't around. Maybe there was, one in New York, but they were unarmed and they had just little copper badges. That's why they started getting called
Coppers.
cops and
Yeah.
coppers. But, you had the town marshal or something, and that was it. The law was the citizen, the armed citizen defending themselves, and then the town marshal would show up and say, "What happened, Bill?" "Well, this guy over here, he pulled a gun on that guy over there, and that guy shot him." "Okay.
Hmm.
Anybody else see it?" "Yeah," and that was it. And then that was the way that was dealt with. If we're returning to that, that's frightening for a lot of people. The whole idea of law enforcement zero is, I think, for a lot of folks, smacks of anarchy. What are your thoughts?
I think it only gets worse.